We're joined live now by Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. Matt.
G'day, Annalise.
Good day. How's it going?
Very well, very well.
For some reason, everyone's been asking me how I am this morning. So
it's Thursday.
I think it is. It's been a very long sitting fortnight, but it hasn't been the most productive, really. We haven't seen a lot of high-profile legislation come through. What we've been talking about is drought and the government's response.
Well, the drought's certainly a very big issue. You're right, there hasn't been much legislation come through, and that's unfortunately because the government doesn't have a plan. I don't think they expected to get elected at the election, so a lot of the legislation we're seeing is stuff that lapsed from the last parliament. But the drought's certainly a very, very serious issue, and that's why Labor suggested it's at emergency and crisis levels at the moment. When you've got towns like Armidale starting to talk about day zero in terms of their water and looking at contingencies for trucking in water, the government really needs to start developing plans, and that's why Labor suggested some sort of war-style cabinet where we work on it on a multi-partisan basis. Certainly be chaired by the Prime Minister. The government would have the numbers on the committee, but let's try and work on this together on a plan to assist some of these rural and regional communities that are really suffering at the moment.
How would this war cabinet be different to what you do now? Surely Joel Fitzgibbon's working with the Nats, with the Agriculture Minister, with all of the ones across the aisle in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, we are, but you don't get the access to the information from opposition that a cabinet does. And a classic example of that is the report of Major General Stephen Day. The government commissioned the former army leader to conduct this inquiry into policies and priorities, what's working, what's not in terms of drought programs and how you can assist rural and regional communities. Now, the government's had that report since April, but they refused to disclose what's in it. They haven't responded to it. So Labor's saying, let's put this drought cabinet together and let's work on a response to that report and whether or not we can make some of those work together.
Now, the discussion last week was really dominated around the economy, especially when we had this IMF downgrade. But there have been a lot of positive moves since then, including that unemployment's not too bad, that the clearance rates and auction rates are going quite well. Surely it's not as doom and gloom as the Labor Party's making out.
Well, you only have to ask the average Australian worker how they're feeling about the economy at the moment, or the average Australian retailer, particularly small businesses in some of those main streets throughout the country. Retail's been smashed in Australia at the moment, and that's confirmed by the figures. So we think that the economy is in a pretty bad state and that the headwinds are not looking good, and that's why the IMF, the RBA are starting to downgrade their forecasts for growth. But what we want the government to do is respond to that, to develop a plan so that we can buffer the economy, you can get a bit more stimulus into it and have people spending again in their local communities. Try and boost wages as well, because wage growth's been in the doldrums for some years now. Just need to develop a plan, and the government's not doing that at the moment.
One of the other big stories this week has been John Setka getting dumped from the Labor Party, or depending on who you talk to, he says he left, but obviously bad terms on his departure. Is this a time that Labor, when you're looking at reinventing yourself after the election, you could be looking at how much influence the unions have on how you form your policy?
Well, look, it certainly isn't a big issue for the Labor Party, and I think we've made the right decision. The values that we want to uphold and we want to project in the community is one of respect for women. And this was an individual who'd obviously been convicted of some very serious harassment charges with respect to women. So the values that we uphold, I think, are very, very important, particularly in these early stages after an election. So full credit to Anthony for taking the action. It was the right decision. In terms of the CFMEU and the union movement, I want to make the point that the CFMEU doesn't represent the atypical union member. The atypical union member in Australia at the moment is a female working in a service-related occupation, predominantly in the public sector. So the typical unions for Australia are the Nurses Union, the HSU and the USU, all of those administrative occupations. So I think we need to be conscious of that fact, that those atypical images of the buffy bloke in on the construction industry, it's not what goes on in industry throughout Australia.
But you guys decide your policy at the Labor Party conferences.
Yes.
50% of the attendees there are from unions. And I'm going to guess that a John Setka type, being the big buffy guy, gets a lot more airtime around the table than the woman who's representing the Nurses Union or the shopkeepers or whatever it is, because they are a very powerful union. And so is it not time to maybe say, why did these unions get so much time in forming our party policies when they're not the ones voting for you?
They actually don't. And that's the misconception, because the unions' delegations to conferences at a state and national level are based on their memberships. So the unions that have a larger delegation to conferences are those service-related areas, like the HSU, like the nurses aren't affiliated, but like the USU and the SDA that are working in service-based occupations. They have a bigger say at many of those conferences. Now, a lot of the times that doesn't get reported because it's not conflict. It's not exciting for the news at a night time. So it's a misconception that I think certainly the Labor Party and the union movement needs to work on and deal with. But I think that the government's approach to this and saying that we're going to target unions because of the CFMEU is misleading, and that's why we've opposed a lot of that legislation, because it hurts nurses, it hurts teachers, and it hurts people working in administrative areas.
But we've seen Jackie Lambie's been pretty direct, saying that her support or decision to not support ensuring integrity lies solely on the fact that John Setka is head of his union. Isn't there something where the Labor Party, if you are working with these unions, could be stepping in and saying, mate, you've got to step down? Well,
that's a matter for the union. We can only take care of the Labor Party rules.
But then the union gets to come and tell you what your policy should be.
Well, the union gets a say in the policy. They don't tell us what the policy is. We operate on a democratic basis. They're one of many, many delegates to conferences that get the opportunity to have a say. But the union has to, deal with their own rules and make their own decisions about their leadership. That's not something that I can be involved in. I'm not a member of the CFMEU. But the Labor Party can deal with our future, our principles and the values that we want to uphold, and that's why we've taken that decision about John Setka.
Now, this review is coming out into Labor's policies that's been undertaken by Jay Weatherall and Craig Emerson. What do you think needs to happen with that review? Will it be something where it's actually outlining all the policies that need to be uptaken, or is this something where it's going to say what the new direction should be a lot more high-level, esoteric kind of document? I
think that the review will firstly look at the election loss and what went wrong, particularly in terms of what policies the committee believes didn't work for us, how our campaign was deficient and the areas that we can improve. And then I imagine that they will make suggestions for the future about how we can improve things, be those structural around the campaign or policy suggestions. So I think that it'll be a good review. It's due in a couple of weeks' time, so we're all eagerly awaiting the findings of it. And once we get that, we'll have a look at it. We'll make some decisions about how we move on. You would have known that Anthony's about to make a speech on Tuesday that will outline our values and our approach to jobs and the future of work. And that's, I think, going to be a very, very important speech that will outline the foundations for how we'll approach this particular policy area. Then next year you'll start to see us get into more of the details about policy and announcing policies.
Do you think too much blame is being attributed to Bill Shorten specifically for the election loss?
Look, the review will no doubt look at that, but it'll look at the job that we all did.
But just you personally, do you think too much blame is being attributed to Bill Shorten?
I think that Bill did a pretty good job, to be honest, as our leader over the last 6 years. He managed to unite the Labor Party. He had us all focusing on policy when you had the government in turmoil and focused on themselves and the leadership challenges that they all went through. So I think Bill did a very good job, and he came to my electorate on several occasions, was well received. We put together a comprehensive policy plan for the country. It wasn't accepted by the Australian people, and we now have to look at where we went wrong in that and make sure that we don't make those mistakes again.
Well, plenty to watch over on the Labor side in the next year. Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Annalise.